Hey, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to look at minimizing boilerplate markup in Angular forms by implementing custom form controls. So open up your laptop, spin up your favorite text editor, and let's get writing some code. Now, before we get started, I want to take a minute just to familiarize ourselves with the project we're using today. As always, if you want to follow along, there's a link in the description below to the GitHub repository that I'm using. Feel free to check that out and follow along. So if we look across in the browser, I've got this project running. We've got a really simple form here with 4 inputs. 3 of them are required and 1 of them is optional. The first 2 are just simple text inputs. They've got a little bit of validation, a bit of error handling on them. If I go to the email one, it tells me that I'm not typing an email in the correct format. And if I clear the box, it tells me that it's a required field. With our third field, it's slightly more complex. I'll start typing in here. It's a password field. It's got similar validation to above, and it's also got this little show and hide button. Once all the required fields are filled in, I can submit the form. Once I submit it, I get a little console log of the form values. And then obviously this last field is just a little bit of fun here that allows us to type in our favorite hex code, and it gives us a little preview of what that color would be. So now if we jump back to our project, at the moment, everything that's happening is all happening in this register form component. It's super simple. We've got a method in here that basically generates our form for us. We've got a method so that when we submit our form, it outputs this console log with the form values. And then finally, we've got this little toggle password visibility method to show and hide our passwords. Now, if we scroll up and we open up the template file, we start to see the issue that we're trying to solve here. Now, each of these form rows is one of our form inputs from here. What you can see as we scroll down is there's a lot of duplication. So we've got this label that's got our errors in here. We've got this input that's got our has error class on it. And then when we scroll down to email, it's almost identical, except for we've just got one slightly different error that we're handling here. Then when we scroll down to our password, once again, it's pretty similar. There's a few differences. Obviously, we've got this show hide button, which has meant that we've got another wrapper div here. But other than that, it's pretty similar. Then scrolling down to our favorite color input, once again, it's more the same. Now, this file is 130 lines, which in the grand scheme of it for a form isn't really that ludicrous. But let's remember we've got 4 inputs here. This is a very, very small form. If we decided that we wanted to have a few more inputs, let's say we wanted, instead of a name input, we wanted a first name and a last name. And instead of our password, we want a password 1 and a password 2 so we can check them against each other. This file starts to grow exponentially. And most of the code in there is just repeated. It's just copied and pasted with a few little values changed. So to start off with, we're going to create a component that encapsulates our standard text input. So first of all, I'm going to comment this out, and then I'm going to create our new component. So I've actually got a folder here. You can put this wherever you want in the project, but I tend to build little form component libraries. So I end up with quite a few of these inputs, so I like to group them all together here. So I'm going to open a terminal here, and we're just going to use the Angular CLI. If I go ng generate, now this project is Angular 10, and I know that going forward with Angular 10, we're going to be relying less and less on modules. But if I'm honest, I actually haven't taken the time out to look into all that stuff yet. So I'm going to be a bit slapdash with modules here, as I always have been. So we create that, and then I want to do the same, but I want to create a component there as well. If I click here, the IDE will update and show us our new module. And then I'm going to open up my new files here and put these in a better order. So first things first, I'm going to change this to using tabs, not a big fan of spaces. And I'm going to remove ng on init because we're not going to be using that at all in here. So we've got ourselves a little empty component that we actually need to import into our registration form here. App input. Add that in, and then we obviously have to import that into our module. If we save this and then we switch across, we see that we've got our input works message here. So we know our component's been added successfully. We're going to jump back across and we're going to start adding our markup into our input template file. Now there's quite a lot of stuff going on with our text input, with our validation and error handling, and there's a lot of styling in there. We don't want to get bogged down with that at first. So to start off with, I'm going to add my wrapper div that has the class form row. And then inside of that, we're going to add our input that has the class of form element. If I save that and then we switch across, that looks more like it. We've now got all of our inputs here. And now to save us some time from filling in this form every time, I'm actually going to jump back across go into our registration form and I'm going to give us some default values in our form to get started with. So I'm going to add my name in here, add an email address, add a password, and then add just any old hex code in here. Right, we save that, we swap back across here. All of our inputs are filled in with the exception of our new one. And this makes a lot of sense because we actually haven't told our form yet that our new component is part of our form. So let's go back into our registration form template file. I'm going to close the rest of these menus so that we've got a bit more space here. And then I'm just going to add our form control name. That's the same way that we've told Angular that all of our other inputs are part of our form as well. So if I save that and we switch across, we're going to get our first error. Now the error says no value accessor for the form control with the name. Now what this error is telling us is that Angular is expecting, because we've put form control name on an element, that's going to be one of its known HTML form inputs. But obviously it's not, because we've just created this component. So what we need to do is we need to register our new component with the Angular form API. And by doing this, we bridge our HTML element with the Angular forms API. So if we switch across to our new input component, we go here, I'm going to type first and then I'll explain afterwards. So what we're doing here is we're registering a new ng value accessor. And as I said a minute ago, that's basically what Angular uses as a bridge between our HTML element and the API. Out of the box, Angular already has these for a normal input or radio buttons or any other HTML form element. Now, because this gets registered before our component is created, we have to tell it what component we're going to be registering. And that's what I've put here. And in this multi-bit, you don't really have to worry too much about that. We're basically just saying that this isn't the only value accessor, this is just part of a group of value accessors. Now, I don't expect you to remember all this. I certainly don't. I forget this more often than not. But that's something you don't really have to worry about. Once you add one of these to your project, every time you want to create a new custom form control, it's basically just copying and pasting with this anyway. So if we save that and then we switch back to the browser, we've got ourselves our second error. Slowly but surely we're getting there. So this time it's saying that our value accessor doesn't have a method called writeValue. And this is our first indication that there are certain methods that are required in a component for Angular to accept it as a value accessor. Now I could just add this one method in here, switch across, see our next error and keep doing that until we've sorted it. Or what I could do is I can go implements, Control Value Accessor. Now what this is an interface that Angular has created for us. If you don't know anything about interfaces, basically what they are is a blueprint for what your class should look like. And in this case, we can see from our red underline, this interface or blueprint requires a certain amount of methods to be added to be valid. Now I've got a smart IDE, which means that if I click here and I press Alt or Option and enter, it gives me the option to just automatically add these methods in. I get a list here of the methods and I click OK and it adds them. Now I know this works out of the box with VS Code. I'm using Webstorm here. I think it works with most IDEs, but don't worry if your text editor doesn't do this. You've got a couple of options. You can either go to the Angular documentation where they list out all the methods you need. You can command or control click on the interface and it will take you through and tell you kind of all of the methods and what they're used for. Or you can just pause the video for a second and take a note of the methods that I've got here. So first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to take this write method and I'm going to add it to the top. I think it makes a bit more logical sense coming first. And basically this has two types of triggers that means that it gets called. It's first called when the form is initialized, and then going forward it's called every time that set value or patch value is called on this form control. In simple, this is fired whenever our value changes. So next up we've got register on change, and this will return a function that gets called whenever our value is changed in the UI. And so for me, the easiest way to think about this is as the Angular API passing us through a method from our control up in our form that we can use to fire the Angular change detection. Next up, we have our register on touch. It's very, very similar to on change. The only difference is this isn't to do with our value changing. It's actually to do with our control losing focus. So on an input, that would be blur When that action is triggered, it then updates our form to say, hey, this input's been touched. We can actually leverage this to only show our validation errors once a user has focused and then blurred a field. And then finally, this one's pretty simple to understand. This is basically a way for our input to be disabled when either the form is disabled or our form control is disabled. So before we get adding the logic for these, I need to add a few variables at the top. First of all, I want to add a public value. We're going to say that this is of type string. For now, to keep things simple, we're just going to make our input a text input, but we could do some clever stuff down the line to make it also a number input if we wanted to. Then, as I mentioned before, I'm going to want to alias my onChange and onTouch methods. So I'm going to create changed. This is of type method that takes a value which we've said above is of type string, and it actually returns nothing. And then we want to do similar for our touched methods, although this one doesn't take a value but still returns voids. And then finally, we want to have an isDisabled boolean, which we're going to use to set our input to disabled or enabled. So all we want to do with our write value method, let's make this more specific, and it's of type string, is we want to map our value that's been returned from this method to our value variable. Then, as I said before, we just want to alias this returned method. And we want to do the same here. And then finally, we just want to say this dot is disabled equals is disabled. Now that there in 40 odd lines is all we need in the TS file to get our new custom form control up and running. Now we have to jump across to our template and we need to implement these new methods that we've created. So first of all, we're literally just going to use the value attribute and we're going to set that to value. So basically, whenever our value in our TS file is set, it updates our input. Now, I see people do this in lots and lots of different ways. I've seen people use an ng model here. I've seen people use forms in their TS files and lots of other things, but I find this is a simple way that works well. Next up, we need to implement our touched and our changed. For our change, we're going to leverage the input event. And we know that we have to pass this a value. So we go event, target, value. And then for our touched, you might have guessed it, we're going to use blur. And that doesn't take a value. And then finally, for our isDisabled, we just use the disabled attribute. So if I save that and I switch across, we can see that our name value has been added from the form. If I remove that, we now can't submit, so the validation is working, and if I add it back in, we can submit again. Then when I submit, we have a look, and the correct value is being passed out of the form. So in its simplest terms, that's everything we need to do to have a custom form field. So now we're going to extend that and make it a lot richer like our form fields below. So if we jump back here, first things first, this is annoying me a little bit. Now the reason that it's telling me that there's an error here is because although Webstorm is very smart a lot of the time, sometimes it's a bit dumb. And all it knows is that I'm trying to pass an event in, and of type event doesn't actually have target value. Now in an ideal world, it would infer that it's of type HTML input element, and so it would know that it does have a value. And if you're fine with this error, ignore this next step. But for me, I'm not, so I'm going to go through and change this. So I'm going to create a new method here. I'm going to call it onChange. We know that it takes an event of type event because that's what's given us our error in our template. And we know it doesn't return anything because we set out our type up here. Now I'm going to create a new constant here and call it value. And we're going to give it a type of string because we know that's what our value from our input is going to be. And then this bit's going to look a little bit gross. So I'm going to tell it its type HTML input element. Then I'm going to say event.target and then value. Now what we're doing here is we're basically telling TypeScript this is of type HTML input element, so don't give me any errors. And then obviously what we want to do is from there, we want to fire our changed methods with our newly typed value here. Then we want to jump back into our template file. We can mug that off and we can change this to onChange. Now, as I say, that's not a necessary step and it does add a little bit of muddiness to our TS file, but it means when I'm building this, I don't get that false error muddying up my logs.
Oh, it's me again. As I was editing this video, I took issue with a little thing that I said there. Yes, if you're doing nothing else with the value, this step might seem a little bit unnecessary, but I've actually demonstrated something you can do here. Say you have a number input and every 3 zeros you want to put a comma. What I can do here is I can intercept the value between the DOM and the form API. I can do that formatting and then I can trigger change detection. So just keep that in mind whenever you're doing anything slightly more clever than this with your inputs. Bye for now.
So if we save that and we switch back across just to make sure that this is still working, we can submit, there's a value in here, we remove the value we can't submit, and if I put another name in here and we submit, we check our form and it's outputting the correct value. Awesome. So now what we want to do is we want to add the rest of the stuff back in. We want to have our label and we want to have our errors and we want to have our styling when our field is erroring. So if we go back to our registration form component and we have a little look here, the first thing that we want to take is we want to take this label. So we copy that. We're going to jump back into our input template. We're going to paste that in there, comment it back in and sort out the formatting. Next thing we want to do is we want to jump back across here and have a look, and we actually need this error class. We can just slot that in there, comment it back in, fix formatting. And then finally, we've got a few attributes here to make everything a bit more semantic. So let's slot those on here. Now straight away, we can see some issues here. We're referencing this name field. If we look in our TS file for the registration form and we scroll up, we can see that name field is just a getter to kind of give us a shorthand of getting our name control from the form. So that tells us instantly that what we actually need to do is we need to let our input component know about our form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an input in here. We're going to call this parent form, and that is of type form group. We need to import this. And then it's no good just having the parent form. We actually need to let our form know what control it is. So if we add another input in here, and we're going to call this field name. This is just going to be a string. And then now that we've got that information, we can do exactly what we've done in the other file. We can create ourselves a little getter in here. We'll call it form field. It is of type form control. Then we need to return this dot parent form get. Then we use our form field. And if you watch my other videos, you know that we need to cast this as a form control, because this get method just says that it's returning an abstract control, whereas we need to be more specific and say that it's a form control. Now, if we jump into our template file, we can change all of these to form field. I'm actually going to copy that and then just paste that over all of these. So if I paste that and then hit save, now we have one more thing we have to do. We actually need to pass this information in from our registration form. So parent form is just registration form and field name is just name. We save that and we switch across to our form. We can now see if we remove this, we've got our validation and our styling working. There's just a couple more things that we need to do. If we jump back to our input template and we have a look, we can actually see that the name is hard coded, and so are all these values here. Now with our name and our ID, we can just use our field name because we know that they're going to be unique. And then I just need to fix the formatting for both of those. And we can remove this. We can do the same up here for the for. And change that to field name. Now we could do similar with our label text. And if I was using a translation library, that would probably be fine. But the issue is, if I put that in there and save it, it's completely unformatted. If my label has spaces in it, it's probably not going to have the same spaces and formatting in the field name. So what we need to do is we need to pass in one more value. So if I go input, public, and we're just going to pass in a label, and we're going to jump back to here and change this to label. Then in our registration form component, we are going to pass in our label, which is name with a capital letter. We switch back across. Everything looks great. Now obviously there's some other stuff we could do. We could pass in a value for is required. That's definitely what I'd do if this was a real world project for me. With that aside, I'd say that we're pretty much done with our first custom form control. But I do have one more thought. As mentioned earlier, the errors here are very, very similar on every control, with some errors even being shared. The only difference is there's occasionally an extra error on each of these. So what I'm going to do, and once again this isn't strictly necessary, I'm going to create a new component to handle all of our field errors. So once again, we are going to go into this folder. We're going to open up a terminal. I'm going to use the CLI, generate myself a module. We're going to call this one field errors. And then the same again, but with a component. I'm going to whiz through this because this one's really, really simple. We jump into our TS file. I'm obviously going to make this tabbed. We don't need any of this.
all we need to do is pass in our form field. So we're going to add an input again. We're going to make this public and we're going to say form field. And we know that this is of type form control. I need to make sure that I import that. Get rid of that. And now we're going to get our first errors from here. We're going to add in our new component here. Import that into our component. Then pass our form field. Now let's move this here. And let's take a look in our template. I'm going to paste that in here. We'll sort out the formatting in a minute. We can see there's something duplicated here. Every single one of our errors is checking to make sure if the form is dirty first. So what we can do here is we say ng container, and on that we can shove an if. We'll say if our form field is dirty, that means we can strip this off of each of those. And we can plop those in here. As I say, I've got to fix the format in a little bit, but that's us away. Now if I save that and we switch back across, we should still have our error handling in here. That's great. And we're ready to jump onto our second form control. Let's close off this field errors component for now and jump into our registration form. Now we can obviously delete this out of here. We don't need that anymore. And looking at it, we can see that this is almost identical to our other form control. So what we can do is we can just take our input that we created before, copy and paste it, make a couple of minor changes to it. And comment this out. And actually the only thing that's different is we have an error here that is not already in our error file. So if I jump back into our field errors and we add our new error in here, let's comment that back in. We can remove this dirty because we've already added that up the top here. And then we can just change this to be looking at form field. Now, if we save that and we switch back across here, we don't have to make any other changes. This is already working. We type in here, we get the correct errors. If I add my information back in here, once the form is valid, we submit and everything is working correctly. Now we can just switch back to our registration form here and we can already just delete this out. That's us done. That's 2 form fields down. Now, if we jump into our TS file up here, we've got stuff that we're not going to be using. I can delete both of those out. They're no longer used. And this registration form file has already become a lot simpler. Now, next up, let's take what we've just learned and we'll apply it to this password field. Now, looking at it, we can already see it's slightly different to our input field. So it's not going to work just to take our input component, put that there and comment this out. We're going to have to create a new input, which makes a lot of sense. A password field works quite differently to a normal input. So once again, we're going to use our CLI. I'm going to generate another module and we're going to call this one password input. I'm going to do that and then we're going to do the same again with a component. I'm going to click up here so that the IDE recognizes it's been created. It's here. So, remember what I said about having to remember everything in this file and how most of it is copying and pasting? Well, we're going to go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to take our providers here. We're going to jump back into our password file. I'm going to chuck this in here, obviously remembering to tell it that we're registering the password component here, not our input component. Then I'm going to jump back to our TS file here. I'm going to grab from implements all the way down to the bottom here. I'm going to copy that and then I'm going to replace everything in here. Now, if I save that, I'm mostly good to go in our TS file. I've now just got to take the markup from our registration form file. So if I take all of this, we're going to copy that. We're going to close these out and we're going to look at our password template. We can get rid of that for now. And we're going to paste our template in here. Fix that format a little bit. Now, first thing we need to do is we need to go through and make all the changes that we made in our input file. First of all, this is no longer password field, but this is form field. And we're going to copy that across all of these. Paste that. This is no longer just a hard-coded password. This is label again. For this, we use our field name. And the same for the name and the ID.
Cool. Let's fix this formatting a little bit. And actually, I'm going to move that down. Now, if you remember, we have to add our value in here. And then we obviously have to add in our event callbacks. So we use input for our onChanged. And remember, we pass in the event. And then we use blur for touched. And let's not forget that we also need to handle disabled. Now we can see we've still got some red bits of code here. This one is just telling us that we haven't imported font awesome into our password module. That's fine. We're using that for the eye icon that we're using on the toggle button. But we can also see here that we've got a variable that's being referenced and a method that's being referenced that we don't have in our password input. That makes a lot of sense if we jump into our registration form component and scroll up. Here is the variable that we're missing. We can now cut that. It's not used in this anymore. And we can paste it in here. And then we need to grab the method to toggle that. So if we jump back to here, go down to the bottom, we can cut that as well and into our password input. We can paste this down the bottom here. Save that, have a little look in here. Is that everything we need? I think it is. We need to obviously add our new input in here. We go app, passwords, input. All of this is the same. And we need to import this into our module. This can be password, password with a capital P, and password again. We save this and we can switch across. We've got our field here. Looks a little bit wrong, but it seems to be working correctly. I think this is just a style that we need to move into our new password component. So if we jump back across, let's have a look what style we're missing. Here it is. Yep, if we take this toggle button style and we look into our password component and we can slot that in there. If I save that and switch back, everything's working correctly. Now if I update this value and go submit, we can see that the password value has been updated. We've got our validation in here and we've got our styling. But once again, we've got duplicate validation code. So what I'm going to do is jump back here. We're going to close some of these files that we're not using anymore. I'm going to have a look in my template file for the password. We're going to grab the validation that doesn't already exist in our field error component. We're going to add our field errors component in here. And remember, we have to import that into our module. And then we have to pass through our form field. If we jump through to this template, we can then add our new error into here. And we can remove this because we're doing this at the top. Once again, if I save this and switch across, everything should be working. We've got our errors up the top here. We've actually got 2 errors because I have left the other one in here. Let's get rid of that. Save that. I obviously meant to do that. I was just testing everyone. If we remove that, we've now got 1 error. And we've got our error about spaces if I try to add spaces in here as well. So what we can actually see here is in a matter of minutes, we've gone from 1 custom form control to having 2 custom form controls. So that little bit of overhead we had creating our first one really pays us back going forwards. And as I alluded to at the beginning, I can now use our custom components to add form fields to this with almost 0 effort. Let's go clear up some of this that we've left over. Let's delete that. Let's go into our TS file. We no longer need this. And as I said, if I decided I wanted to add a check password in here, I can add this. I'm just going to change this to password 2. I'm going to give it a new default value. Then I'm going to look in my template here and I can just take this, paste that there, change this to password 2, save it. We go back to our form. And we now have 2 independent password controls here that were added by literally just copying and pasting 4 lines of code.
And with that, that's everything that I wanted to cover in today's video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're not already subscribed, make sure to do so because I've got loads more videos coming your way. If you have any questions, leave them below and I'll make sure to get back to you as soon as possible. And other than that, just take care of yourselves.